the value proposition about why we're doing this, and of course be focusing on what the outcomes are and what people are going to be able to do with this. So just a little bit about APG. Our focus is really trying to help improve systems engineering and information technology capabilities by using proven methods and techniques, and we do that through contributing to a number of industry standard organizations and trying to apply those best practices to clients' needs. So we're members of the Object Manager Group, where we work on, again, formal modeling languages like UML, SysML, defense frameworks like UPDM, UAF, as well as being involved in the development of a business architecture Metamodel with that team. We're also members of the Open Group, where we work on enterprise architecture best practices, all at TOGAF, Archimate, as well as a new IT business architecture reference framework called IT for IT. And we also, again, participate at the Business Architecture Guild, which is where the BIZBoK guide is produced by a community of practicing business architects, and partners with a couple of tool vendors, and of course provide training through some accredited programs with some of those organizations. So, what we're really talking about here is, some of you guys and gals might be familiar with, but if not, here's an introduction. There is this thing called the a Guide to the Business Architecture Body of Knowledge, commonly called the BIZBoK Guide, and really the whole framework that's described within that perspective is the idea that we want to build a business architecture knowledge base that's composed of some predictable kind of content for certain purposes. We want to be able to visualize and share that content with different stakeholders. The BIZBoK calls those things blueprints or maps. And some of the great stuff that's in the BIZBoK guide is some guidance on what kind of scenarios you might find yourself in that are particularly likely to be relevant to applying business architecture best practices, namely what types of viewpoints are you likely to be most interested based on, again, 12 commonly encountered scenarios such as mergers and acquisitions or joint ventures or compliance, so on and so forth. But one of the things that we think is a real opportunity is to try to bring some a little bit more formality and clarity on how can we model this kind of content using currently commercially available tooling. And so, what we'll be talking about the rest of the presentation is, how we've taken a look at what are called the core foundational domains of the business architecture knowledge base, which are the 4 gray rectangles in the middle yellow circle: capability, organization, information, and value. And the idea behind the reason that they're considered core or foundational is that this is where most organizations are likely to start populating their repository based on the commonality of those elements in virtually all scenarios. And they also tend to be the elements that are least volatile over the lifetime of an enterprise. Doesn't mean they don't change, but they don't change dramatically on a regular basis. And they're also the foundation on which we can build other perspectives, which is described by the extension domains that surround it. And there are actually 5 of those: stakeholder, policy, strategy, product, and initiative. And those are extensions because you might not use all of those in every circumstance. It's a little bit more specialized usage possibly. And the fact that some of those perspectives may have a little bit more volatility as it relates to how they evolve and change over their lifetime. So again, the BIZBoK guide is a body of knowledge that's available to members of the Business Architecture Guild, and certainly recommend folks that are interested in a deeper dive into that, join the Guild. It's a pretty reasonable entrance fee, and then you'll have access to this content plus a lot of other benefits. So the value proposition of this project is basically a number of us like-minded spirits, connected via our practice, and found out that we were members of the Guild and had an interest in trying to figure out how people were going to try to actually do modeling of this stuff in the real world. So we got together at the Business Architecture Guild and came up with a value proposition about why are we doing this, as opposed to it being some cool semantical metamodel exercise that sounded like fun. We want to actually be very practical and pragmatic. So this is about trying to uplift the professionalism of the practice itself. So again, if we look broadly at the architecture profession in general, and in particular the enterprise architecture profession, usage of formal modeling solutions is an emerging expectation for sustaining and formalizing those practices. And so it makes a lot of sense that the business architecture community, which is certainly the more nascent of the four traditional domains of enterprise architecture, providing a platform where people can move from the typical office productivity tools like Visio or Word, Excel, PowerPoint to, again, a more formal, sustainable solution. We also, obviously, at the Business Architecture Guild have a vested interest in wanting the end user community to adopt a BIZBoK grounded approach because we feel it is the industry's best representation of best practices. So, if we talk about, again, working with end users and establishing a business architecture capability, and then eventually the discussion gets to, okay, well, it sounds like a great idea, but let's start doing it, but we need a solution to help us manage this content. We'll have, again, the ability to do this in many commercial tools that already exist. This also will provide the foundation for doing customization to the Metamodel, because that's a very common circumstance in most architecture practices. It's great to have a starting place with some of the fundamental concepts, relationships, and properties, but almost every organization does some tweaking to that based on the specifics of the use case they're trying to respond to. Plus, you can add additional, element types and relationships of something of the BIZBoK out of the box. And particularly if we can, do this in commercially available UML modeling tools, it's highly likely that those tools support other frameworks and notations. So we'll be able to integrate that business architecture content with, more other enterprise architecture frameworks like TOGAF, or people that are using the Archimate modeling language, or if you're in the defense industry, UPDM, UAF. A lot of people use these tools to do business process modeling with BPMN. This would allow us to do, business architecture mapping to operational design, which is often one of the things we're interested in as it relates to, for example, value streams and business processes. Systems engineering organizations that use SysML are people that are, again, trying to actually deliver these solutions, where in many cases, in 2017, it's highly likely that any business architecture-driven transformation is going to likely involve IT. How would those traditional UML models fit in? So again, providing a standards-based approach towards creating a complete picture across the enterprise, for those organizations that are prepared and interested in doing that. So what are we building? Well, we're building a number of things, but trying to do it kind of from the bottoms up. Fundamentally, and where most of the work is we're building this thing called a UML profile. And for people that might not be sure what that is it's basically an extension mechanism built into the unified modeling language that allows us to easily extend the language to create, in many cases, domain-specific languages in ways that are easily implementable by commercial UML tools. So one of the expectations of most of those solutions is that you should be able to define a profile and then have that represent your customizations in the modeling environment. So, by building a UML profile, we'll be able to, load that into, any commercial UML tool that supports profiles, and immediately people will be able to do modeling in the context of the BIZBoK guide. So that defines the base meta types, metadata, and meta relationships. We're going to make that open source tool so that, again, people can actually acquire the assets directly themselves, which are ultimately XML files, so people can actually do that customization. But we do have a particular modeling platform in mind based on a lot of the people that are on the team. Namely, we're going to take that UML profile and add some things to it that are specific to Spark's Enterprise Architect. And so that's what are called MDG technologies and MDG add-ins. And so without getting too much into the gory details of that, that basically is extra stuff that you can define an enterprise architect to take a UML profile and then on top of that define new types of diagrams with special toolboxes, special scripts, report templates, and other goodies. And that's something we're considering that might possibly be also open source. And then on top of that, there are plans, but this hasn't even started, so this is really kind of the long-term roadmap. That we're going to build what's called an MDG add-in, and that would be, some kind of .NET assembly that would allow us to do very advanced things outside of more typical UML kind of software systems engineering modeling. So we can, render different types of dashboards and charts and other analytic behaviors on top of that. And for people that are interested, if there's anybody that is a member of the guild and wants to join the team, because we're still working on this and have a roadmap kind of planned out for the remainder of this year, and I'll talk a little bit to that later. Here's a picture of the home page. Again, APG, we're major contributors to this, as well as AIMCO, the Alberta Investment Management Company up in Canada, Federal Express, and then the Guild Metamodel team at the Business Architecture Guild, and the OMG team that's working on the industry standard Business Architecture Metamodel. And so very much interested in people not just contributing, but also testing out and giving us some good critical feedback. So what we're going to do for the rest of this is talk about what we built and what some of the preliminary things look like, and we'll kind of again, we're going to focus just on the core foundational domains, because that's really what we've been focusing on mostly. And again, I'll kind of go through the rest of the roadmap later. But we're going to do it in the context of first looking at the meta model. So this is something that we also built as a part of this project because we needed to have some good foundation on which to make decisions about how to implement this in a UML profile. So we're going to start off simple with the organization perspective. So, what you're seeing here, and this is something that again is available for guild members to see, and eventually will be likely available to everybody. The organization is the focus of this. There are 3 different types of organizations: business units, collaborative teams, and partners. Organizations may or may not be legal entities, depending on what we're trying to model. Or could it be, again, joint ventures? Organizations interact with other organizations. There may be the notion of organizations being composed of organizations, particularly business units, divisions, departments, so on and so forth. And as you can see here, I'm not going to go through every one of these. The organization has a lot of relationships with other elements that are in the other domains, particularly capabilities, value streams, which we'll talk, value stream stages, which we'll talk more about a little later. Let's see, and then of course, initiatives, stakeholders, policies, and strategies. So once we've defined, what the things are, what their properties are, what their relationships are, we can then start making decisions about how we might render it. So this is, pretty simple, as you might not be surprised. So here's an example, kind of traditional org chart, where we're basically using kind of a nested box diagram to represent that composition relationship. And, the toolbox that we've defined for this within the MDG technology allows us to create all of these different elements and use the specific relationships to build the basic organization map. And then for every element type or every domain, we wanted to create at least 2 types of diagrams. One that was a basic map of that element. So this is the organization map toolbox on the left. and then a cross-mapping diagram, and that's what the toolbox on the right represents. So we still have the same kind of elements on it, but then we've got a special section for the items that might be involved in the cross-mapping. This particular screenshot here is from an earlier version because we just got finished updating or completing the Metamodel, so there's a lot more cross-mapping that we've identified, so this will get updated. And then the relationships that are going to be used to do that kind of cross-mapping. So the idea is that, we want to provide, pretty good guidance in the toolboxes and diagram types so that when people are building these different business architecture viewpoints, they don't have to think too much about what kind of elements to use and what kind of relationships to use. Of course, one of the most critical viewpoints that's often a little bit more interesting and provocative is the capability model. And so here we've got a view of how the BIZBoK thinks what a capability is and how it's related to other perspectives. And without going into great depth about capabilities, which may be a topic as far as I know of some other folks that are talking today, this is supposed to be a representation of what an organization does, independent of who does it, how it's done, or why it's done. It's just, what do we do? And it's a very common model to be built in the business architecture practice for a number of reasons. But here we've got the idea that according to the BIZBoK, a capability may have there's a 3-level stratification level that the BIZBoK suggests, namely that any capability is at the strategic level, the core level, and the supporting level. There's some basic properties that the BIZBoK says should be a part of a capability. It's a criticality, which is a simple subjective ranking from 1 to 5, and then a common usage of a capability model or a visualization of it is to create some kind of nested box diagram and then color code the capabilities based on some dimension. And those dimensions can vary greatly, but we often might attribute a heat map status to them, such as it's working well, it's problematic, it's a capability that doesn't exist or should. So again, what exact characteristics we use can vary much on use cases, but those are some of the fundamental ones that the guide describes. And then we've got the idea that capabilities produce and require outcomes, which of course have relationships to other things that we'll talk about later, value items and information concepts. Capabilities can depend on other capabilities, and as we'll see when we get to value streams, capabilities enable the different stages of a value stream. We also expect capabilities to be, again, decomposable into some hierarchical structure. When we're doing strategic planning and initiative planning, we often are interested in what capabilities do those touch. And then we often use capabilities to provide organizational context to where are those capabilities operationalized across the enterprise. And so we might have relationships to organizations and the idea of what the BIZBoK calls a capability instance, which is, again, really the localization of a capability in a particular organization. And so the next couple of slides are just going to be, and I'm not going to show you more of this, but just to give those that might be technically inclined on or interested in what a profile might look like. And that's what we're going to see here in the next slide. So here's how we defined the capability profile in UML. So we defined a new stereotype called capability, and it's got a number of different properties. But we chose a UML class as the meta type in UML that was the most close to a capability. A capability instance was going to be an extension of a UML object, which is often an instance of a class. That kind of made sense. And then a capability outcome was going to be represented using a UML state. From our relationships, we got the same kind of decision to make. So we looked at the Metamodel and saw that we needed a composed of relationship. That seemed to make sense to represent as a composition relationship, depends upon, a dependency, produces, requires as associations. And in some ways, these decisions are somewhat arbitrary, but the whole idea is that, we can look at UML semantics about the meta types and the meta relationships and just say, well, what's the closest thing in UML that kind of gets to the gist of this relationship? We pick that, put it in the profile definition, and then create again that new stereotype to represent that customization. So here we got an example of the alpha version that was released a couple months ago, where for a capability map, we've defined two basic diagram types, a cross-mapping diagram and a simple traditional capability map. And here we see an example of a capability map. This happens to be APGs. This is just FYI an incomplete capability map. There's certainly a lot more things that should be on here based on the scope of our business. But, I think when we build models like this, we want to be always cautious about boiling the ocean, which is often something that's thrown at the enterprise architecture profession. And in the context of the business problems we're trying to solve right now, this is the slice of the enterprise model that's relevant. And of course, people might claim, well, how do you know if the other parts aren't relevant if you don't write them down? Well, we're not a huge organization, got a pretty good idea what's going on. I know where we're trying to make investments and trying to make optimizations, and I think these, rectangles represent that. So this is a diagram, pretty straightforward, and again, we can see that in the model, we actually are representing the hierarchy of capabilities, using nesting. And one of the things that we are going to provide as a part of the solution is some scripting, for example, that will automatically generate this diagram from the model. So again, if the model already knows what the hierarchy is in the parent-child relationships, there's really no reason to have to spend, half a day trying to figure out how to do this nesting. So there's going to be a script available where you basically will be able to say automatically create the nested hierarchy diagram, and it will create that. And again, this is a pretty simple diagram, and right now, again, what you see right here is pretty much just nested capabilities, but we expect that we'll probably create another diagram type, like a capability specification, that will get into a little bit more of the details, including where you describe what the outcomes are. And then we've got the cross-mapping toolbox, which we'll see a usage of that a little bit later, where we've got, again, different elements in different domains and the associated relationships conveniently available to people. And one of the things that we're trying to explore, and as best we can, is give people flexibility on how they might want to render this content, as well as looking for feedback from the end user community of what renderings and styles are most interesting, compelling, and useful. So this is an alternate way of representing a capability model as a, showing the hierarchy explicitly using lines and levels like this. So this is just an alternate way to do the same sort of thing. Although we tend to see people doing the nested boxing far more frequently for capability stuff. Now let's move on to the value domain. And so here we're going to actually see this kind of in two parts. I personally think this is one of the more compelling parts of what the BIZBoK has to offer, as well as just the overall importance of this in the business architecture practice. Because it's really easy, for whatever it's worth, to get sucked into capability modeling and doing great, wonderful things with it, don't get me wrong. One of the most common things that people use it for initially is to help rationalize the IT application portfolio, to see where there's opportunities for simplification, unification, and other investments. But we just want to keep in mind that a capability model is very inward focused. Namely, it's really about what we do, but often people, if they look too exclusively at a capability model, may lose sight of why they do those things and on whose behalf. And that's what the value model is really trying to get to. We've got some additional content on our website if you're looking at, want to take a deeper dive into this topic. But the whole idea is that we really want to understand who our stakeholders are. So that's really kind of the outside-in approach. And then try to describe what value propositions they desire. Namely, why do they want to do business with us? What are they going to get out of it? So really trying to take, again, that customer-centric view to the enterprise. And then once we understand stakeholders and value props, then we can start trying to figure out, well, what would we call those series of activities that we perform to deliver that value proposition? BIZBoK calls that a value stream, which is, of course, triggered by the stakeholder. And then the value stream is decomposed into finer-grained elements called value stream stages, of which stakeholders may support or interact with as well. And of course, there's mapping to other elements additionally. So what we'll do here is take a look at the 3 diagram types that we're making available out of the box: a value map, again, cross map for all of them, and a value stream specification. So here we've got another example from the APG world. We do training and consulting and coaching. So one of the ways that we might think about why we're in business is we have a stakeholder called a customer who desires a value proposition of uplifted workforce capabilities. And because of that, they trigger the train workforce value stream, which we claim delivers upon the uplifted workforce capabilities value prop. So one of the other things that comes with creating a profile like this is, the first example we looked at wasn't all that interesting. It was pretty much just a nested box diagram. But we've got the ability to think about, well, what kind of symbols and notation do we want to use? So I'm sure many of you recognize that stick figure guy in the upper left. Well, that's a UML actor, and we figured, hey, that's actually a lot of what's used in some of the examples in the BIZBoK guide, although it's not explicitly prescribed that thou shalt represent stakeholders as actors. Made sense to map that to actor. We're using a symbol that is often used for an event or a process for the value stream and the value stream stages, and just using, again, simple associations with stereotype labels for the relationships, and then a special little balance symbol for the value prop. And so we've got a toolbox to help us construct that. But once we've identified the value streams that are important for the business transformation initiative, we can then take some of those value streams and refine them, and that's where we take the value stream stages and articulate them with additional properties. Again, there's a lot of stuff on this diagram. Again, not going to go through all of it, but the notion is that value stream stages deliver individual value items which collectively contribute to the overall value proposition. And an individual value stream stage, the navigation through those stages is controlled by whether or not a certain set of criteria are true or not. So every value stream stage has a set of entrance criteria and exit criteria, and we find, at least at APG, that a convenient way to represent that, as we'll see a little bit later, is to show the entry and exit criteria as information concepts in a particular state. So let's take a quick look at what a value stream specification might look like. And like I said, this is all example content. In this case, we're actually exploring a couple different notational variations. This is one of the more simple ones, where we represent these supporting stakeholders as swim lanes, i.e. activity partitions, and then we put the value stream stages that they support inside the partition, create a dependency-like relationship from the value stream stage to the value item, and this is really, in my opinion, this is the minimum amount of work you should do on a value stream. Namely, if you do not identify the value items out of the value stream stages and verified that they all contribute to the value prop, I'd claim you're missing the whole point of a value map, which is all about value. And not clearly articulating that, can be a major risk. So what we're trying to show here is that, the beginning of this is the customer wanting to understand training requirements, and the value that comes out of that is clear customer expectations. Then we want to arrange the logistics with the training facility, so we've got appropriate facilities, register for the training session so we understand who our target audience is, deliver the training session, and that would be individuals having improved skills, and then ultimately closing the training session on the behalf of the customer to deliver targeted customer feedback. And again, our claim is that those 5 value items together all add up to delivering upon uplifted workforce capabilities, which we're showing using a aggregation relationship. And so we subsequently, again, have a detailed toolbox for the value stream specification. And then there's a lot of different things we can do with respect to value stream cross-mapping. But one of the most common things is to cross-map it with the capability model. And this is a really positive thing from both sides of the perspectives, namely, this is a way for us to understand, well, now that we got a better description of why we're in business and what value we're delivering, how are we doing that? Namely, what capabilities do we have in place to support that? So for understanding training requirements, we need to be able to do client management, proposal, quote management, and sales around services. For arranging training logistics, event management, facility management, and instructor management. And you'll notice that for the remaining value stream stages, it's not unusual for the same capability to show up more than once. And so event management, not surprisingly, shows up in all of the remaining value stream stages. So this can help us make better contextual decisions where if we're saying, hey, I think we could really do something to improve value in the deliver training session value stream stage, what are the capabilities that we're going to probably have to take a peek at? This also serves very significantly in validating and rationalizing the capability model. Namely, it's been my experience that putting together a hierarchical structure for categorizing things, which is ultimately what a capability model is used for, it's really hard to gauge the effectiveness or appropriateness of it in a vacuum. But as soon as you start using it to categorize and map things, that's when you really start to understand it and bring some different perspectives. So that's one of the other reasons we think the value stream capability cross map is very useful, because it really helps you look at your capability model and make sure that you've kind of laid it out correctly. And you just get a different perspective when you do that by lining it up against the value stream stages. All right, we got 2 more domains to go through. Next one is information. And so the central point of that is the information concept. This is often, or I often think of this being very similar to, if not identical to, the notion of information architecture, which sometimes I think about as the data architecture of the business architecture. So this is, we're really trying to represent what are the core concepts of the things that we think and talk about in our business, and really trying to, document and formalize our organization-specific language, which of course may be informed by the industry vertical we're in and any frameworks that come with it. So, when as you'll see when we take a look at one of these diagrams, I kind of think this is pretty typical kind of, high-level data modeling kind of stuff, or ER sorts of stuff. So we've got information concepts. They're related to other information concepts. There may be some parent-child decomposition relationships. We think at APG that it's important to not just understand data at rest, which is, what is the data, what are its relationships and properties, what governance policies might it be subject to, how it's related to capabilities and value streams and stuff like that. But understanding the life cycle of information, we think is very, very important. So the idea is that we want to keep track of information concept states. So this is where we're going possibly a little bit beyond what the BIZBoK guide explicitly says in the current version, but it certainly hints at it in a couple places. And then using, instances of those information concepts as in a particular state as a way to represent value items and entry and exit criteria for value stream criteria. So we've created 3 different diagram types for information: the information map, a special one for information, the lifecycle diagram, and then a information cross mapping. So let's take a look at a very simple information map where we're taking a look at the information concepts that are pertinent to the APG training of, train workforce value stream. So the whole idea is that we've got events, and a special type of event that's pertinent to this value stream is a training session. An event has a statement of work associated with it for a particular customer that came from a proposal. We have a registration records that we keep track of as it relates to what people are going to attend or plan to attend the event, but we differentiate registration from actual attendance. So those are the people that actually showed up. We use the word student to represent an attendee for a training session, and a representation of someone completing attendance and successfully performing various exercises and assessments. They're given a certificate of completion, and we of course want feedback through a course evaluation. So real simple, I think of this very much as a high level, conceptual kind of data model thing. But again, it's very useful in making sure that we're using the right nouns in our capabilities. So there's a great affinity between the capability map and the information map. And as you'll see in a little bit, there's also great affinity to the value stream specification as it relates to the entry and exit criteria. So we've got a toolbox for that, and a set of pretty traditional relationships that you might find in UML-based data modeling, so associations, aggregation, compositions, generalizations, and possibly getting into association classes, which might be getting a little bit into the weeds as it relates to things that may turn into associative entities in a more logical data model. And then, of course, the ability to do cross-mapping to all the other different domains. And like I said, we'll see an example of that with value streams in just a little bit. So the information lifecycle map, again, I think this is really, really a critical viewpoint. It's not one that we create necessarily for every single information concept, but in the case of a training event, since we do quite a bit of that, and there are business rules around how we, change the state of a training event based on where it's at in its lifetime, with the activities we perform as a part of moving a training event through this model. But, in trying to keep it pretty simple, this is a high-level diagram that's trying to show, well, a training event starts off being scheduled. After it's scheduled, it then is opened for enrollment. And once it's opened for enrollment, it either gets closed because we've hit the maximum number of students, or the registration date is expiring, or we could decide to cancel because we don't have enough people, or there's some logistical issue. Once we're in the closed state, we could also still cancel or possibly reopen it for additional registrations. After it's closed, we set up the event, deliver the event, and then the training event is actually completed. So some of you might recognize this as a real simple UML state machine diagram, which is exactly what it is. However, as you wouldn't be surprised, I would urge you to be very careful about ever telling anybody in the real world that's what it is. For whatever it's worth, I find it more informative to come up with alternate names for these diagrams because we don't, the consumers of this content really just don't need to know some of the gory implementation details. It's really totally irrelevant. So this is why we call this, again, a life cycle model, but it really, again, from a foundational perspective, is a simplified state machine diagram. And so that's what we kind of see on the associated toolbox. Initial, final states, choices, junctions, forks, joins, states themselves, and transitions. But here's where we can, put together another thing that I think is, again, particularly important to help rationalize the value model with the information model, is using the information concepts in state as a way to represent the entry and exit criteria. So the whole idea with this, and this is, described as being a critical part of making a value stream more clear and specific, is how do you know that you're supposed to start a value stream stage? Well, when a proposal goes to the submitted state, then we're ready to understand training requirements. After we then, of course, have discussions with people, our hopeful outcome, or at least to proceed to the next stage and exit this stage, we are expecting a statement of work that's been approved. And then it just happens that the exit criteria of understand training requirements is the entry criteria for arranging training logistics, where the exit criteria for that is a scheduled event. And after we register people for training, we have an event that's in the setup state. And then once the training session's been delivered, the event's in the delivered state, which then allows us to get to the closed training session value stream stage, where we have returned course evaluations from all students and have provided them with certificates of completion. And this is really a good way to represent or have a little bit of discussion on the navigation through a value stream stage. So through a value stream, because one of the things that we have talked about, and be curious about other people's feedback and perspective, is that we really want to be careful that people don't think that value streams are just abstract business processes, which is often a way that we kind of introduce the concept to people, but they're really fundamentally different things than business processes. So we want to get away from representing that, this is just a sequence. And in fact, in BIZBoK, business process is not considered to be architecturally significant. It may be architecturally relevant, but processes, and I think this is appropriate, are really operational design things. They describe how your different parts of your organization actually might implement a value stream, but they are, again, detailed design specifications for the business operations. So we want to really make sure people don't fall into a common pitfall of thinking these are abstract processes. So we basically decided that we were not going to promote people being able to draw lines between value stream stages. But then people are like, well, then how do I represent that? There is kind of an order. Well, it's pretty clear in the BIZBoK guide that the way you navigate through a value stream stage is by the state of the various information objects. And so the way that you move from left to right is by describing these inputs and outputs much more succinctly. So we think that coupling the value stream model with the information model and a life cycle model is a real, hopefully an elegant solution to fine-tuning the value models. And then, of course, depending on the feature of your tool set, but this is very common in most modeling solutions, is not only can I represent relationships graphically by nesting things or drawing lines between things, I can also extract that content in a traceability matrix. And so here we're just seeing different visualizations of the same graphical content you saw earlier namely the upper left showing how value stream stages have entry and exit criteria as it relates to information concepts, and then how each value stream stage is enabled by one or many capabilities. So that's basically what I had for everybody. Hopefully, looks like I was able to kind of hit the 45-minute mark, maybe not as quite as long as it could have been. But in conclusion, you know, what our hopes are is that this UML profile for the BIZBoK guide, you know, is going to increase the level of adoption of formal modeling in the business architecture profession. We have released the first alpha, focusing on, again, these 4 foundational domains, and have to have a beta version ready in the next couple of weeks. So one of the things is that we're very interested in people that are willing to test this out. So if there's people out there that have the availability and the wherewithal and possibly the need, because you're actually trying to do this in the real world, we'd be very excited to have you participate. We have finished the Metamodel for all 9 domains, and you saw, again, representations of that in the various diagrams. And the thought is that we'll begin building out the UML profile for that as soon as we finish the core stuff later in June. And our hope is to deliver a complete solution of all 9 domains and the various diagram types and toolboxes by the end of the 3rd quarter this year. And then once we've got that in place, of course, there's, you know, we're very hopeful of additional refinements over the next couple of years. But again, the whole idea is that this is going to be publicly available. Again, in the end, you are not going to be required to be a member of the guild to use this. But if you're interested, again, in beta testing it and contributing to the development, that is where we would like you to join. So thanks so much, everybody. I'd be more than happy to take any questions or comments if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, thanks very much for the opportunity.